Thank you for joining us today. Welcome, everyone. I know it's been really busy. It's still the first day. My name is Sri Santineni, and I have Divya Lati here. Divya is the Senior Vice President at Moody's ESG, and she leads the Cloud Platform Engineering team. My role at AWS is a Senior Engagement Manager, and I deliver cloud projects for financial services firms, such as Moody's. And this is one of our projects that we delivered, and it's around how we use serverless and microservices to generate ESG data that can be leveraged by other financial services firms. So without further ado, starting off with the introduction, starting off with the agenda. What we want to cover today is give a quick introduction of Moody's and explain what Moody's business is. Then give a basic understanding of ESG and the factors which are used to measure ESG so that you can connect with the story. And after that, we'll go a little bit deeper into the architecture and explain the product, the various steps, and how we achieved the product which was released earlier this year to thousands of companies. Quickly talking about Moody's. Moody's is a global risk assessment firm, and it does two things in a great way, which is primarily providing credit rating opinions and also providing financial risk assessment solutions that can be leveraged by companies to do business better and make decisions faster. Moody's has two entities. One is the Moody's Services, which does the credit ratings, and these credit ratings are used by investors and issuers for their debt instruments, and most of you might have heard about credit ratings and the opinions that Moody's provide. Moody's, or MIS, has been doing this for the last 100 years. So far, MIS has rated $73 trillion in debt, and this was done across 35,000 entities and transactions. Moving on to Moody's Analytics. Moody's Analytics was founded as a separate entity in 2008, and Moody's Analytics initially started off as a licensing of credit rating opinions, but slowly it spread, and currently it provides analytics solutions that helps with risk management and growth. And this can be a licensed product that can be used for your business, for your business and gaining insights. Currently, there are 14,900 customers who use Moody's Analytics. And going on to the next slide. A quick introduction of ESG. ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance, and I believe you all know that. That's why you're here. So diving a little bit deep into the fact that what constitutes these three pillars. So for the environmental pillar, as you already know, conservation of the natural habitat and environment forms the crux of it. And this is measured using carbon emissions, right, which is a common term. I'm sure while you're taking a flight here, you know exactly what is the carbon emissions that we are leaving, right? Apart from that, we do have various other factors such as water usage. And I was so happy to hear the news that AWS is going to be water positive by 2030, right? That was the news that came in today morning, what that means is all of the data centers will produce more water than it consumes. Other factors also include deforestation, water usage, and many more. The second pillar is social. Social talks about the relationships between the different people businesses interact with. These can be customers, these can be the employees, these can be the communities the businesses serve. So the social is measured using factors such as workforce diversity. Workforce diversity is a factor that can help us understand underrepresented groups and make sure there is equality. Gender and equal pay policies, health and safety, some of the other factors that contribute to social. Finally, we have the governance. Governance are standards for a company and on how it is running its company and the ethical policies that may ensure that the company is running in the right way. And this can be primarily measured using the board structure, the audit structure to make sure there is transparency, executive compensation to just make sure that it is following standards, whistleblower policy, tax transparency are some of the factors that contribute to this governance pillar. Now that we know what ESG is, how many of you all think that ESG is a mandatory regulation that companies have to do, and it is another reporting that you have to do? You can raise your hand or nod your head if you think it's a regulation. So I was in the same bucket. I was thinking it was a regulation, right? This was a few years back. But soon I realized it's a mistake, right? Firms shouldn't treat ESG as a mandatory regulation, though there are some reporting needs. It should be treated like a risk. And primarily for financial services, it is a reputational risk, right? The reason, and I can deep dive a little bit into it because it's close to my heart. It is a reputational risk because of the way everyone here is making decisions, right? 3 years back, you wouldn't have probably considered the things that into your decision-making process because of things like Black Lives Matters, right? So Black Lives Matters is an example of social justice where equality is at its core, right? The second example we have is global pandemic, where we have clearly seen there is economic fissures across the world. And finally, we all have seen wildfires, right? And wildfires across the globe and within the US, they really changed our mind about climate, right? So climate change is a current thing. And we all have to be trying to make, we all have to make decisions so that we can reverse that or at least stop the decline. So with that in mind, reputational risk is the key word I want you to take away from this slide. Now with that in mind, there are various financial services priorities that we have. Some of the examples that we do have is primarily asset management, right? So management firm or asset fund manager want to create sustainable investment funds with the help of underlying ESG data. And secondly, banks. So banks are the biggest, Taking a step back, banks lend us loans, right? bank lend loans to the businesses as well. So the biggest emissions are on its balance sheet, right? If you're lending loans to a firm that causes emissions, banks are asked to start disclosing the emissions, and this is called as financed emissions, right? The financed emissions need to be disclosed by the banks, and this slowly but surely is becoming a mandate because 3GHG reporting, according to that, you have to disclose the financed emissions. And finally, every firm is reporting its ESG using sustainability reports, and that also needs benchmarking data. So the common layer that you see across all the priorities is this central ESG data that is curated, certified, and has lineage where you can make sure that everyone knows where this data is sourced from and how I can use the data and provide feedback in case the customers need any additional factors. Going to the next slide. So Sri, what's the big deal? Go collect the data. Every asset fund manager can do it. Every bank can do it, right? Just go do reporting. So the key challenge that you have is, first thing, there is no single standard of reporting. What that means is sustainable report of Amazon is different from the sustainable report that's produced by Moody's. So when you deal with unstructured data, there is a lot of manual work involved in it, and that causes cost, right, and errors. So that's the first challenge, right? And also it's voluminous. When you think of large cap in an index fund, right, S&P, so it's like a lot of firms that you have to get the data for, curate it, make it usable, right? Forget about insights. The second challenge that we do have is primarily infrequent reporting. So ESG, a sustainable report, is only done annually. So if you are doing it annually, let's take energy and gas sector where there is an oil spill. All of a sudden, that oil spill is not reported. It might be a news event, but an asset fund manager, if he's not actively catching up, he wouldn't get that feed. And what that means is your data, ESG data, is not going to correlate with your stock price or the financial information, and the data will soon become irrelevant, right? So that data has to be faster and proper and should be accessible to the asset managers. And finally, after all of this, uncovering the insights from the ESG data, there are 400 plus factors that you can consider to make a decision. Now, what is the weight for each of the factors that you're going to use? This is something that you need to go to an SME, create a model, build the weighted model to figure out how you can even start using it. So these present a challenge to all the asset managers, and 66% of the asset managers who were involved in a survey asking why they are unable to create sustainable funds using ESG data, 66% of them told that the reason is accessibility of this data, right? This slide is talking about the financials, like, well, there is a business case, I agree with you, but does it make financial sense? And absolutely it does, is what this slide is talking about. The first three things that you see here is just talking about the increase in sustainable funds, investment funds, and how they are performing, right? When you compare with other companies who are not, these sustainable indexes and the funds are performing much better. And finally, this is the market capitalization, if someone starts providing the ESG data tomorrow, the licensing of that data can fetch you this much is a high-level analysis, but it just brings to the business case, is there a business case? And this is talking about the business case. Quickly moving to why is Moody's interested in this and what is Moody's wanting to do? So as I have introduced at the beginning that Moody's is in risk management and assessment space, and it has 100 years of experience in that space. So it's only natural that Moody's customers are going to ask, hey, why don't you bake this data into your risk models, right? So that's the inception of it. Also, there's an increased ask for primarily regulation needs. The SFDR reports, which is a European-based regulation. So there is a need for the reports. So also tackling that for Moody's customers. And then the final thing is creating a new revenue stream. As we have seen, there is new revenue stream that they can tap into. With that, I'll hand over to Divya so that we can go through the 5 steps and deep dive into the architecture.
Thank you, Sri. Hello, everyone. I'm Divya Yeleti, Senior Vice President at Moody's, heading the ESG Cloud Engineering team for data. Right. So I'm here today to walk through our journey in gathering ESG data. Right. So what does it involve to gather ESG data? So let me break this down into 5 simple steps. Step 1, before you start capturing any of the ESG data, you would like to lay the foundation for your ESG reference data. And I'll walk you through details of each of these steps, right? So lay that foundation of ESG reference data. Step 2, once you have that foundation where you know what you're after, then you go and start collecting the publicly disclosed ESG documents by a given company. That's step 2. Once you have the documents collected, right, now your goal is to extract the ESG-related information surrounding to your methodology from within these documents. That's where AI machine learning comes into picture. And step 4, once you have extracted the information from these documents, now you enrich the data. You vet this data. That's where ESG specialized analyst comes into the picture to review this data and validate it. Once it's vetted and validated, the last step involves it's now ready for distribution and given a certain ESG scores based on your methodology. Sounds so simple and straightforward, right? So now let's see how the architecture looks like if I combine all of these 5 steps together into one picture. That's how it looks like. Looks like a mini village of its own, right? But I will break down each of this architecture in detailed steps in the upcoming slides. All right, let's go to step 1. Gather your ESG reference data. So what does gathering ESG reference data would mean, right? Establish a list of your reference tables that might contain, for example, what is your ESG methodology that you want to go after? And the methodology would involve, what are these metrics, ESG related metrics? What are its criteria? What are its indicators, to name a few, right? Once you have that foundation laid, the next step is obviously, which companies are you really interested in capturing this data? What is your coverage looks like for ESG data, right? So these are some of the minimal reference data examples that I can name a few, right? Once you have this and establish the relationship, of course, it's reference data tightly establish those relationships within these data sets, right? We also have a need where we want to get certain attributes, additional attributes associated to these reference data set from our trusted external sources. For example, index data or exchange rate data, to name a few, right? So you have to have a pipeline to fetch this data. The last step involves, a very important step in this process, is reference data management, right? So how do you manage these reference data? So what does reference data management involve? So it could be as simple as a change management, where you might want to add a company to your coverage, or you might want to remove a company from the coverage. Or you might want to add a metric for your methodology, or you want to remove a metric from your methodology. Sounds simple, but if I dig deeper into further scenarios, what happens if your company moves sectors from one sector to another sector, right? How does it involve or affect your subsequent data capturing process journey? What happens when there are acquisitions or mergers within a company? How does that affect your reference data, right? And how do you ensure like all of this is tied together before going into the next subsequent steps? So these are the core foundations of capturing your reference data. Now, let me walk you through what are some of our challenges that we have faced in handling the reference data. Data governance is one of our biggest challenges. And it's not just for these 5 steps of ESG-centric data gathering process that it is a challenge here. No, it's across the enterprise. When you look at this data, right, we have learned that it is not just for ESG, but it is an enterprise-level taxonomy used across enterprise products and services. That might include your credit ratings or risk assessment products. You got to have this, consistent system of record across your enterprise data sets. So how this ESG data can evolve into core fundamental ESG reference data across an enterprise. How did we go about solving for some of these challenges? So this is how the high-level architecture looks like. On my right side, you see a pipeline that has, pulling the data sources from our trusted external vendors. We have leveraged AWS Glue for that. And on my left side, you see an interface for change management, right, from a user perspective. In the middle is what you see, the microservices. Now, these microservices are not just used for change management of this reference data alone, but they are also integrated with the subsequent 5 steps that I'll walk you through in this ESG data journey. This is all reusable, and the reason being is these microservices gives you 2 benefits. One, you're not duplicating your code. Second, this is ensuring your data lineage and consistency across your other systems. Whether it could be, those systems could be internal to ESG, or it could be external to your enterprise. There. So now we have collected our reference data. Now we are ready to go after our documents for ESG. So most companies disclose ESG data. These are publicly available documents that we can go and collect after. Now, what does this document collection process involve? Right? So we have global ESG analysts across the world who are expertise in ESG that are going after these companies and collecting these publicly disclosed ESG documents. Now, what is important as part of this collection process is you cannot just collect a document without tagging a metadata to a document, right? So you want to have that lineage intact. So as part of this collection process, you want to tag the document with the metadata associated that you have created, or sorry, what we have created as part of the step 1 process, right? So tagging that metadata into that document is important from data lineage and consistency point of view. Now, once you have collected these documents, you prepare these companies into batches or portfolios, as we call it internally, to feed them into the next step in this journey, which is extracting the information off of these documents, right? Sounds straightforward. Not really. Now let's see what are some of the challenges that we faced. Data inconsistency and manual collection, right? Why data inconsistency? As Sri stated, not all companies disclose this information in a standard form. There is no standard way of reporting ESG data. And every company has its own way and style. Some companies give this out in PDFs. Some companies have their own HTML pages. And some companies even go a little deeper into these, where they can have embedded HTML links inside the same web page. And that level can go as deep as it can, right? So that's part of the challenge. Now, the other part of the challenge is not all companies have the same cycle to report the data. Some of them do quarterly, some of them do annually, right? So that is also causing a challenge in capturing this data. You don't have a set cycle or a set window when a company can disclose its information. And data lineage, I know you will be hearing me talking about data lineage over and over. Bear with me, because it is the most important piece in this collection process. And of course, it's a manual process today, where analysts are spending so much of time in capturing this data. We are in the process of automating this, mostly leveraging machine learning libraries. But we are not completely there yet in that journey. For now, it's semi-automated, as I call it, right? So what does the architecture look like, right? Same serverless framework, as you see in the reference data. The only difference is, you have a front-end interface to upload this data on the left side, and on my right side is what you see, DynamoDB, that is used to store the metadata of these documents, and S3 to store the PDFs, or any version of the documents. In the middle, again, you see microservices, and these microservices are not just microservices used to capture the documents, but they are also tightly integrated with the microservices that we have created in step 1 of reference data from a system of record point of view, right? And bear with me, these microservices are also going to be used to be tightly integrated with the next step in this journey, right? Great. So now we have captured our reference data, collected the documents. What next? Now we are ready to extract the information from the PDFs or HTMLs or unstructured data. So that's where AI machine learning comes into play here. What does this involve? Now remember, we have created portfolios, and those portfolios can include a group of companies that have completed the document collection process, or it can also include companies that are grouped under a specific sector, or any combination. Now, these portfolio of documents are fed into our machine learning AI machine learning process, which will go and extract the information surrounding to our methodology of ESG and pull these key paragraphs or data out, right? Now, once it's extracted, now we have to prepare this data and be it ready for our analysts to come in and review this data in the next step. Now, let's see what are some of the challenges we faced during this process. Now, with any machine learning model, you won't get 100% of accuracy on day 1. It's bound to have some noise, or more noise, depending, right? So it's that some of the challenges involve redundancy of the data. For example, the same information of our methodology being found in multiple pages of a single document, let's say, for example. That's one of the challenges. Second challenge involves the complexity of how companies might embed this data inside a document. Let's say, I don't know, maybe another HTML box or a tabular format, something that machine learning did not anticipate to pull this or expect to have the data inside that, right? Or it could be as simple as a basic page number where the information was found to be missing. So for that machine learning to improve its efficiency over a period of time, it needs active learning, right? So you gotta make sure that the analyst who reviews this data or make any corrections get actively fed back into this process and make sure that the model learns using this data. And the last but not least is scaling, right? The portfolio of companies can include X number. It could be big at some point in time, depending on the cycle at which a company is disclosing information, or it could be small, right? So your model should be in a position to scale itself to accommodate those kind of data. Now, in this architecture, I'm going to walk you through what happens after machine learning extracts the information, right? It's not, once the portfolio of batches is being sent to our machine learning model, once the processing is done, it sends a signal to the next process. And we have leveraged AWS Lambda to scale up or down, depending on the number of records or the amount of data the machine learning model has pulled from that particular portfolio. So depending on how big or how small the portfolio could be, your Lambda just scales up and down and consumes or ingests these data for the next step to come in. Great. So we have reference data, we have documents, we have extracted information off of these documents. What next, right? So this is where what we call it as data enrichment, where our analyst comes in to review this data, right? So let's see, what does this involve? So the data points that we receive from machine learning process doesn't just go or ready to be consumed by an analyst yet. There are certain steps that happens in between. So what does that involve, right? So the first and foremost is it standardizes the data. What is standardization, right? Standardization is nothing but, depending on where the company is located or what their convention look like, the metrics can be displayed in its own convention. For example, some companies can disclose them in kilos. Some companies disclose the same information in tons, depending on where they are or what their standard approach is, right? So we go through standardizing of that data into local convention to make it easy for an analyst to review it data so they don't have to do their math on their mind while they are reviewing the data, right? And the second thing that happens is the data validation. As we discussed, there could be some noise generated from machine learning, right? So you filter that noise as much as possible to reduce overhead on an analyst. So drop those redundant data sets, which you don't need to, right? So that's one of the cleansing. And the second step that happens is make sure that this data is neatly tied with all the previous steps that we have discussed. Make sure it's tied with your reference data. Make sure it's tied up with your document data that you have collected. So once you have that system of record nicely organized, analysts to come in and review it, that's what happens before all the pre-steps. Now it's ready for analysts to review it, right? What does analyst review process look like? So it's done in 2 phases and 4 steps. So that's how rigorous our review process is with around this data. And I'll talk more about the architecture. What does that look like from an analyst point of view, right? And the last step is finalizing this data and ready for consumption globally. What are some of the challenges there? Depending, again, on the size of your portfolio, you might have data coming back from machine learning model, millions and millions of data points. So the architecture should be scalable enough to handle this volume. This is per portfolio, by the way, right? And the second piece is you have to obviously make sure your architecture is highly available because of our global presence of our analysts who are consuming this data. The next step is, while we were part of this journey, we were still evolving in terms of data requirements. So your design should be flexible enough to handle those changes or modifications, right? And the last step, obviously, which I haven't stressed in my previous steps, is data validation, which happens at every step from completeness perspective. Hey, did you capture all your documents from step 2? Did you capture, did machine learning generate or capture all the metrics associated to your methodology in your step 3? Step 4 comes in. Did your analyst review every single data point surrounding for your methodology from completeness perspective? So these are some of the data validations. So how does the architecture look like? So this is not as straightforward as it looks on paper, but when you look at it from left and right point of view, on the left side is where we have our user interface who comes in to look at this data. And on the right side is what we have our backend, Amazon DynamoDB. And you can also see in this picture streams. So DynamoDB streams is what we use to standardize this data. We also have leveraged Athena connector for DynamoDB for anyone who is SQL proficient if they want to look at this data. We don't have to do anything additional. In middle is what you see, the microservices, right? Now, what are some of the technical checks that happens around this tool here that we are talking? Flexibility, as I said, is very important. What is important when you are considering the architecture is understand your query patterns. Understand your needs of the data, how an analyst is asking for what kind of data, what kind of flexibility. For example, are they looking at the data at a criteria level? Are they looking at the data at a sector level? Are they looking at the data at a company level, right? So give that flexibility. For you to give that flexibility, you have to nicely organize the data in such a way in your DynamoDB to leverage, those indexes and keys nicely organized so it can give you that optimal performance and efficiency. So flexibility was our biggest ask. Now, it doesn't depict in this picture, but you don't want to be waiting for analysts to complete their review and then figure out, oh, you know what? This is not right, this is not right, this you have to go and fix, this you have to go and fix. So the tool has to be flexible enough that it does that check as the analyst is reviewing the data and notify them of these issues. Let's say, what happens actually when analyst is coming in this tool is they can do two things. They can create some new entries where machine learning was not able to pull it out of their document, right? Or they can modify an existing entry where they think that machine learning did not pick a right information. So as part of these corrections, you have to ensure that the lineage is not broken at all. It has to be still consistent across the board. So all those checks should actively happen in the tool while they are reviewing the data and notify them, hey, go and make these corrections, right? So that's just naming a few of the data validation checks that happens on this tool, but there are many more to begin with. You might also want to ensure that you also notify your analysts that there are no outliers or gaps in this data as they are correcting. And you also don't want them to be looking at the same company, obviously, right? Two different analysts cannot be working on the same data set. So you have to build in all of those checks and balances inside the tool for them to be able to doing their day-to-day jobs. That's just to name a few. But there is more that really happens in this process. Now that the analysts had vetted this data, the last step of this is score and distribute. We are now ready to roll, right? The analyst reviews the completeness of the data for an entity, and it prepares a report and then say, hey, you know what? I'm done with these companies. Boom. It sends this, goes to the next process, generates the scores. But I'll talk through what are different steps involved when they're scoring a company. Obviously, validate and score the company. Data points are, again, validated in the scoring process just to ensure for completeness and beyond. And the last leg is distribution. What are some of the challenges, right? So alignment, this is more of a process challenge than a technical implementation. Alignment across different teams to ensure, requirements of how they score a company versus how you collect the data should always be consistent. You cannot have a scoring process or scoring team expect a certain metrics which you are not, or an analyst is not being aware of to collect. That's process challenge. Adjust to constant model changes. You have to have the architecture for scoring should be in a way that it should accommodate for any modeling related changes in the data. Flexibility, right? Your scoring process should be flexible enough that it should be able to handle a real-time way of scoring a company or a batch way of scoring X set of companies. Data lineage, as I mentioned, should always be when you score a company and give this data out, you obviously just don't want to give the score out, right? You want to give the proof. How do you come to the conclusion of that score? You want to make sure that you give all that information that supports how you scored a company to your investors who are interested in this data. Last but not least, you should also have flexibility in your architecture to rescore a company if given there is a need or an opportunity or if required. How did we went and solve for it? This is primarily leveraging step functions and glue backed by lambdas. So as part of this process, what happens is the first step is, like I said, validate it again, just to make sure you're sure, right? Every company that validated through this process goes through the next step, which is what we call as derivation. As part of scoring process, you also derive some new metrics based on the data or metrics that you have collected. That's what is called as derivation. And then you eventually score the successful companies. But the important aspect here is when you are scoring a company, you're not just taking the publicly disclosed information of a given company. You also want to ensure if that given company has any controversy generated. Is that company in use for any controversy, right? Obviously, that affects that company score. So that also comes in from our data lake, which is not depicted here. It's primarily showed as like a small S3 bucket, which is called as data factory here, but that is a process by itself. What is our data factory looks like? So it's very, very much modern, built on AWS cloud, which is leveraging metadata-driven architecture, where you don't have to write new piece of code every time you get a new file to ingest in your data factory. You just have to define the metadata of this, and the factory should be in a position to consume it automatically all the way through code. So as part of this data lake, what happens is we categorize the data in 3 buckets, which we call it as bronze, silver, and gold. The first step is called bronze, where it goes through a minimal checks to ensure your schema is right, your counts are accurate, so and so. And the second step of this is silver, which happens like if there is any transformations involved or more sophisticated data validation checks. Eventually, before it comes and lands in gold for distribution. Yes, that process also happens. The output of the scoring goes through that process inside of Data Factory before it goes out for distribution. There. This concludes all the 5 steps that we talked about in this village. But it's not, just, it's people, process, and technology all coming together to create what you are seeing on the screen here. A tidbit is, IT can also contribute to ESG, right? How many times did you can create a code that should be sustainable enough where you're not running X number of times and consuming your data center capacities. You can also contribute, all the engineers here can also contribute to ESG when you're designing a code. But I'm not done yet. This is, very good. What next? Where is the resiliency in this picture, right? So that's the next question we usually get. Where is the resiliency? So we set some of the goals for our resiliency here, where it says, okay, your RTO is X less than an hour, whatnot, right? And durability of your data that you have committed, how does it survive? Redundancy across your regions, and how do you test your resiliency without impacting your users? This slide is just a high-level view. I probably need another hour or so to talk through challenges across the resiliency for each of these architecture. But what I can state is being on serverless actually eliminated some of the complexities. I wouldn't say complexities, probably it's like additional steps that you have to probably implement with the non-serverless way of building things, right? And example, things are coming out of the box. For DynamoDB, you have global tables. S3, you replicate it, but with a catch that if you have to go to more than 2 regions and you come into a mesh architecture, that's where it can get tricky for that replication, right? And at stages where we have a front-end interface was straightforward. But for data pipeline, which involves step functions and so on, you would need some customization where you have 2 options. One, either you start from where it has failed, rerunability, built-in rerunability in your code, or you just start over from, again, step 1, right? Two choices to go with. All right, probably I'm getting you all bored, I'm not sure. But that's all from my part. This concluded my session here. Hope you had enjoyed this session, and I now pass over to Sri for product outcome and closure. Thank you.
I promise this is the last slide, yeah. And we can take questions. So just to wrap it up, this is the 10,000 feet level of what we have accomplished. The horizontals are the platform capabilities that we have built. The verticals, or the rows versus the columns, are the ones which talks about the process from inception to scoring and distribution. So Data Factory, what we haven't covered is Moody's acquisitions and how we consolidate data from the various sources which are not the public documents. So that's done in the Data Factory. We haven't covered this at detail other than the scoring. And it converts, we consolidate the data, we score it, and we distribute the information, but it also has history and trending analytics of all the ESG data. The data capture is nothing but a workflow tool with the backbone of microservices, which we discussed at length. And this helps source hundreds and thousands of documents, run the machine learning, provide analysts a way to validate this data and certify this data at the level that they want, which can span between an entity to sector. And then this this also can take care of the same data can help with SFDR reporting as well. So the key business outcomes is we are able to launch the product and Q1 2022, and this product contains, we can't disclose the number, but it's tens and thousands of entities, which is processing, hundreds and thousands of PDF documents, which is the sustainable reports 10K, 10Q, and all of these each entity has more than 300 metrics that are scanned, and a final score is also published. With that, we conclude the presentation, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you.